The Vikings were masters when it came to preserving food, and their centuries-old methods could completely change the way you think about food storage. From butter buried underground to fish preserved in ways you won't believe, these ancient techniques could outlast your smartphone, your car, and maybe even your mortgage. Let's dive right into something you don't hear every day. Bog butter. It's just what it sounds like. Butter the Vikings buried in the ground. Forgotten for centuries, then found again, perfectly preserved and still edible. The Vikings didn't just rely on the cold, they mastered the land. They buried slabs of animal fat, wrapped in birch bark or wooden barrels, deep inside oxygen-starved peat bogs. Why? Because bogs aren't just swamps. They're natural refrigerators. The chemistry behind it is wild. Peat bogs are cool, dark, and acidic. They block bacteria, shut out oxygen, and preserve fat, like it's treasure. Butter was more than food. It was currency, medicine, and even used to pay taxes to Viking chieftains. And here's the part that baffles modern food scientists. Archaeologists have found big lumps of this butter in Ireland and Scotland, some of them more than 1,000 years old, and it was still technically edible. Smooth, waxy, almost cheese-like. Not spoiled, not rotten, just aged. Even today, in some Nordic farms, butter is stored underground to mimic this Viking technique. But what happens when modern chefs try it? One Danish chef said, "It tastes like leather and smoke, but it's still food." And that's only part of the story. Because if Vikings could preserve fat for centuries, wait till you see what they did with honey. They found honey in Egyptian tombs. But did you know the Vikings made the same kind of honey last hundreds of years in the freezing north? Vikings treasured honey not just as food, but as ritual. It was smeared on wounds, offered to gods, and brewed into mead, their legendary fermented drink. But more than that, it was a shelf-stable sugar bomb that never went bad. Why did it work? Because honey is a moisture vacuum. Bacteria walk in, dry out, and die. Add to that the natural acidity and enzymes from bee saliva, and you've got nature's most perfect preservative. The Vikings didn't know the biochemistry, but they knew the results. Honey sealed in clay jars, stored in longhouses, remained golden and thick even after years of war, sea raids, and winters colder than death. And here's the wildest part. In Norse belief, bees were seen as sacred, tiny messengers of nature's wisdom. Every spoonful of honey wasn't just food, it was energy, healing, and a gift from the gods themselves. So every spoonful, a taste of immortality. But it gets crazier when you find out what the Vikings did to keep fish fresh during multi-week sea raids. And that's coming up next. It may look simple, but this was the Vikings' edible shield against hunger. And it could last for months without molding. Imagine crossing the North Sea, knowing your next meal was stuffed into your belt pouch. And it wasn't meat or fish. It was flatbread, dry, sturdy, and surprisingly versatile. Vikings made it from barley or rye, rolled thin and cooked on hot stones or iron griddles until crisp. But the magic wasn't in the recipe. It was in the dryness. These breads were cooked hard, baked to eliminate moisture. The result? They didn't spoil, they snapped. Now here's where it gets clever. These weren't flaky pastries meant for flavor. They were engineered for travel. Hung from rafters, stuffed into chests, carried across continents, and when needed, softened in soups or ale to make them edible again. Flatbread was so essential that some Viking graves included a stash for the afterlife. You heard that right. They buried warriors with bread. Because a Viking with no flatbread in Valhalla? Unthinkable. Those crisp breads in your health aisle? Straight from Viking longhouses, and it gets crazier when you realize these ancient crisp breads were the blueprint for today's Scandinavian knekkebrød. But the next food? It wasn't just portable, it was practically indestructible. You'd think dairy couldn't survive Viking winters without going rancid, but the Norse cracked the code with this one creamy weapon. Meet Skyr, the Vikings' version of yogurt, but thicker, tangier, and far more durable. Think of it like edible armor, packed with protein, low in fat, and dense enough to outlast your milk carton by months. But here's what blew everyone's mind. Skyr wasn't refrigerated. The Vikings stored it in cool cellars or underground pits, often in sealed clay jars. The live cultures in Skyr actually fought off spoilage bacteria, preserving it longer than most modern cheeses. Some batches even matured like fine wine, richer, sharper, and stronger with time. It wasn't just food, it was strength. Warriors ate it before raids. Mothers gave it to children, and entire communities relied on it during the darkest winters. Even Norse sagas mention Skyr. Some warriors were said to bring a bowl before battle, believing it gave them Thor's endurance. Oh, and here's a twist. Iceland still makes it exactly the same way today. That's over 1,000 years of fermented genius. Still undefeated. Today, it's sold in stores as a trendy superfood. But to Vikings, it was war fuel. But that's only part of the story, because the next Viking staple wasn't even solid, yet it never spoiled. This Viking drink wasn't just for feasts, it was medicine, morale booster, and liquid treasure. That never spoiled, only got stronger. Mead was the Vikings' golden elixir, made from fermented honey, water, and wild herbs. But what made it special wasn't just the buzz, it was the longevity. You could bury a bottle for a decade, dig it up, and it'd taste better. Fermented with natural yeasts, mead produced alcohol high enough to kill bacteria and preserve itself. No preservatives, no refrigeration. Just a chemistry miracle made in wooden barrels and sealed clay pots. And here's where Norse mythology kicks in. They believed mead was a gift from the gods, literally. In Norse legend, Odin stole the mead of poetry from giants, giving it to gods, poets, and warriors. They believed it could spark brilliance in battle or inspire great verse. So to drink mead was to drink the words of the gods. Vikings took mead on voyages, stored it in underground pits, poured it at rituals. Some even brewed healing meads infused with wild herbs like yarrow or juniper, an ancient version of Viking Gatorade. And the best part? Archaeologists have uncovered 1,000-year-old mead residue still intact inside Viking drinking horns. Better to fight with a full horn than an empty gut, said one Norse elder, a line found scratched onto a drinking horn fragment. But if you think their drinks were clever, wait until you see how they use blood to make food last forever. Sounds brutal, right? But this Viking food was high protein, rich in iron, and didn't rot for weeks when stored correctly. When Bjorn Ironside's camp ran out of meat, they turned to the last thing they had: blood, barley, and guts. The result? Blodmore, Viking blood sausage. In a world without freezers, the Vikings wasted nothing, especially not blood. After slaughtering livestock, they mixed the blood with barley, herbs, and fat, then stuffed it into intestines and boiled it. Here's why it worked. The boiling killed bacteria, the barley soaked up moisture, and the natural casing sealed it from air. When smoked or dried, it could last for weeks in the open air, or even longer buried in cool earth or hung in wind-sheltered storage barns. To the Vikings, this wasn't gross. It was resourceful, life-saving even. In harsh winters, blood sausage offered one of the densest, most sustaining meals, iron-rich, calorie-packed, and ready to eat with just a quick slice. Fun twist? Warriors ate it cold before battle, believing the blood made them more fearless. And in Norse lore, spilled blood was sacred, so consuming it in a way honored the sacrifice of the animal. But it gets crazier because the next Viking food was buried for months, and that actually made it better. This next food smells like ammonia, tastes like death, and lasts for months buried underground. Yet Vikings saw it as a last resort lifeline, a food so fierce it separated the weak from the worthy. Meet hakarl, fermented Greenland shark, a dish so intense even modern chefs gag at first bite. But for Vikings, it was survival food with a side of bragging rights. Here's why it worked. The Greenland shark is toxic when fresh, full of natural urea and trimethylamine oxide. So how did they eat it without dying? Simple. They buried the shark for up to 12 weeks. Literally. They gutted it, pressed it under stones, let it ferment underground, and then hung it up to dry for several more weeks. The fermentation process broke down the toxins, preserved the flesh, and made it, technically, safe to eat. But safe didn't mean easy. Even today, Icelanders say it smells worse than it tastes. But Vikings believed it made them tougher. Some even claimed it gave visions, connecting them with ancestors or gods during long, dark winters. Still think beef jerky is hardcore? Then get ready, because the next one isn't meat. It's a root that kept Viking ships fed for months with zero refrigeration. Before potatoes ever hit Europe, Vikings had a root that held up to frost, time, and hunger. And it's still underrated today. Turnips. This humble root was a Viking pantry essential, boiled, roasted, mashed, or fermented in earthen jars. But what made it incredible wasn't just its versatility, it was its shelf life. Properly stored in dry pits, straw-filled barrels, or packed with sand, turnips could last through brutal winters, even when snow blanketed the fjords and hunting was impossible. And it wasn't just food. Turnips were feed for animals, mash for spirits, fodder for warriors. Even dried turnip slices were used as trail rations, chewy, earthy, calorie-rich, and nearly impossible to spoil. Fun twist? In Norse folklore, turnips were sometimes carved and placed near homes to ward off spirits, a practice that eventually inspired modern jack-o'-lanterns. So the next time you pass the turnip bin at the store, remember, these roots helped fuel some of the fiercest raiders in history. But things are about to heat up, because next comes the Viking version of chili oil, and it could survive any season. It wasn't just ship sails that caught the wind. Vikings knew their survival depended on what drifted beneath the waves, and one of the most overlooked? Seaweed. In coastal Viking settlements, dried seaweed was a secret weapon, rich in iodine, calcium, and essential minerals. They harvested it by hand, rinsed it clean, and hung it over wooden racks to dry in the salty breeze. Once dried, it could be crumbled into stews, added to bread, or even chewed like jerky. But here's what made it powerful. Seaweed never spoiled when kept dry, and it remained edible for years. It also helped prevent goiters and other iodine deficiencies long before they understood what that even meant. And it wasn't just health. Vikings burned seaweed ash to make glass, soap, and even helped fertilize barren land with it. In sagas, there are mentions of seaweed being gathered after storms, like a gift from Aegir, the sea god himself. But if you think seaweed is strange, wait until you see what they drank to honor their ancestors. No sugar, no problem. The Vikings tapped trees and boiled sap into a syrup so rare it was considered sacred. In colder regions where honey was rare, Vikings turned to birch trees in early spring as a sweet, renewable gift from nature. The sap was collected in clay pots and gently simmered down over open fires. What remained was a thick, mineral-rich syrup packed with antioxidants and natural sweetness. And here's where it gets interesting. Birch syrup didn't rot. When sealed in earthenware and kept cool, it could last several years. It was used to glaze meats, sweeten breads, and even as medicine for cough and fatigue. Some Viking healers believed it helped cleanse the winter blood. And unlike maple syrup, birch sap only flows for a few days each year, making it more precious than gold. A good harvest could feed a whole village through the year, but that was only part of the ritual, because once the food was stored and the fires were low, it was time to survive something colder, darker, and far more dangerous. So, how did Vikings sleep at minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 34 degrees Celsius, in nothing but fur and wool? Without fire, without heat, and without freezing to death? That's what I'll show you next.